Hello, I'm Ilan Kelman, Professor of Disasters and Health at University College London. I present here the potential impacts of climate change for humanitarian shelter and settlements. The research which I do related to climate change covers a wide variety. I do a bit on projections and models, but really most of what I do is climate change adaptation, especially at the local level, but also considering international approaches and processes. I also do a lot of work on the health impacts of climate change, again, from local to global levels. Here, I provide headline summaries of key topics: disasters, conflict, and migration. If you would like full scientific papers on any of this material, if you would like to discuss it, if you would even like summaries, then I'm happy to provide those. Please just contact me. You can do a web search for my name and track me down. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram, I'm on LinkedIn, or simply an email is fine. The first step is understanding what climate change is. By United Nations definitions, climate change is weather statistics changing over decades. That is it. Long-term changes to the weather. Climate change has happened since the Earth formed, and these natural influences continue. The real issue today is how rapidly and substantially human activity is changing the climate. We are releasing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. We are destroying ecosystems which absorb these greenhouse gases. The increased greenhouse gas concentration traps more heat from the sun and heats up the planet, which changes the weather. There is no doubt that human-caused climate change is happening and happening swiftly compared to many natural processes. But then what? Does climate change cause weather disasters? The disaster is not what the environment does all the time, such as earthquakes or weather, because sometimes we get a disaster from environmental extremes and sometimes not. How society deals or cannot deal with the environment determines the disaster. We do not use the phrase natural disaster because disasters are not natural. They come from our decisions, not the environment. Now, climate change by definition is changing weather statistics. The issue is not whether or not the rain changes. The issue is whether or not our umbrella works. The usual saying is there is no such thing as bad weather, only bad clothing. But not everyone can afford an umbrella, not everyone can afford good clothing, not everyone can afford good shelter from the rain and wind. So climate change is not the issue for humanitarian shelter and settlements, because climate change just changes the weather. Disasters are the issue for humanitarian shelter and settlements, and disasters are not caused by the weather and not caused by the changing weather, with exceptions. One huge exception is a higher heat and humidity from human-caused climate change. Climate change is creating heat-humidity combinations where, much more frequently, indoor temperature control is essential to survive. Not everyone can afford 24/7 cooling, and many people have to work outdoors. When heat humidity goes beyond human survival, there is little we can do. For heat humidity caused by climate change, humanitarian shelter and settlements must think about disasters and about day-to-day life, because heat humidity is going to affect huge swaths of populations lethally. Another type of disaster is conflict. And the media love phrases such as climate conflict and climate wars, yet we don't wake up in the morning, look at the thermometer and say, hey, yesterday it was 33 degrees Celsius, today it's 34 degrees Celsius, therefore I'm going to start a war today. Of course, this doesn't happen. And it's the same with resources. Human history is rife with examples of resource abundance leading to peace and conflict, and examples of resource scarcity leading to peace and conflict. When it comes to collaboration, cooperation, war, peace, conflict, there are always so many factors. And these factors come from people, not the climate. It is not about how the climate is changing. It is about people making decisions. So be wary of media connecting climate change to conflict, with Syria as a perfect example. For Syria's major drought in 2010 to 2011, yes, there was definitely a much higher likelihood of that drought happening because of human-caused climate change. Over the previous century, Syria had 3, maybe 4 major droughts, which were as bad or even worse than 2010 to 2011. And over previous decades, Syria had been led by oppressive dictators who completely mismanaged the country's water and agriculture. The country was ripe for a conflict, irrespective of climate change. And even without climate change influencing droughts, there would have been a major drought in Syria at some point anyway. Similarly, migration. We know that the number of climate refugees is 0, because the definition of refugee, at least for now, does not include climate or environment factors. At the moment, there cannot be climate refugees, there cannot be climate change refugees. We also know that migration is a typical human condition. The key is to give people migration choices while minimizing forced migration. For climate change, again, heat humidity might force people to become climate change migrants. Sea level rise and ocean acidification are other possibilities, but the science provides us with so many provisos and so many nuances that it is very hard to say that mass forced migration will inevitably occur from changes in the ocean. So we hear numbers 200 million or 1 billion. Those really have no basis for the calculation nor for the result. And no one forced to move because of a cyclone or a drought is a climate change migrant, because storms and droughts are weather, while the disaster, the mechanisms forcing them to move, do not come from weather. Overall, the science tells us that, yeah, there are some reasons why climate change is important for humanitarian shelter and settlements. This is mainly heat humidity, but there are other factors which could become more prominent in the future. Irrespective, we have to be very cautious of the exaggerations and misapprehensions. We should instead stay with the basic science while avoiding the rhetoric, buzzwords, and errors often promoted. In contrast, climate change is a popular topic. The populism of climate change means that it can bring in donations and project funding. In the end, it seems that no matter what the science says, climate change becomes very important for humanitarian shelter and settlements simply because of the politics of funding. Thank you.